When God speaks from the whirlwind, Job's story of surrender and hope. Life is filled with questions that shake us to the core. We look at the pain in this world, the suffering of those we love, and the trials that never seem to end. And something inside cries out, "Why, God?" It is the cry of a heart longing for answers, for meaning, for justice in a world that feels so broken. The Book of Job stands as one of the most powerful and mysterious stories ever written, because it dares to give voice to that cry. It does not silence the questioner. It does not pretend that pain is simple or easy to explain. Instead, it places us face to face with a man who lost everything, who wrestled with despair, who sat in the ashes and lifted his trembling voice to heaven. Job was not a distant figure, locked in an ancient past. He represents every one of us who has stood beside a grave, who has sat awake through sleepless nights, who has wondered if God sees, if God hears, if God cares. His wounds mirror ours. His honesty makes us uncomfortable, yet his faith is unshakable in the midst of darkness. The beauty of this book is that it refuses to give quick answers. Instead of presenting a neat formula, Job teaches us something far deeper, how God runs the world in ways far beyond our understanding. It shifts our focus from demanding explanations to beholding the greatness of God himself. In this sacred story, we find a God who is not afraid of our questions. A God who does not scold Job for crying out, but meets him in the whirlwind with majesty and truth. And in that encounter, Job discovers what we too must learn. The answer is not in the why, but in the who. So as we open the book of Job together, we are not stepping into a tale of despair, but into a journey of divine wisdom. It is the wisdom that reminds us we are not abandoned. It is the wisdom that points us to trust when we cannot see, to worship when we do not understand, and to rest in the God who holds the universe in his hands. This is not just Job's story, it is ours. And in its pages we will discover the breathtaking wisdom of how God runs the world, not with cruelty, not with chaos, but with a depth of love and sovereignty that eternity itself will one day reveal. Number 1. Job's story. The cry of every human heart. The story begins with Job, a man the Bible describes as upright, blameless and God-fearing. He was not only wealthy in possessions, but rich in faith. His life seemed to shine with blessing, family, prosperity, honor, and peace. But in a single sweep, his world collapsed. His wealth was stripped away, his children taken in tragedy, his health shattered. In the silence that followed, Job sat in ashes, covered in sores, his voice trembling with questions that echo through the centuries. What makes Job's story so powerful is that it does not hide the rawness of human pain. Here is a man who loses everything and dares to ask God why. Here is a man who does not disguise his grief behind polite prayers, but lets his soul pour out in honesty. He does not curse God, but he refuses to pretend that everything is fine. That tension between faith and anguish is the heartbeat of the book of Job. Job represents the cry of every human heart that has tasted suffering. When we bury a loved one, when our prayers seem unanswered, when betrayal or disease tears us apart, we join Job in asking, where is God in this? His life is not just a story from long ago, it is a mirror reflecting our own valleys and shadows. Yet, even in his sorrow, Job teaches us something profound. His questions are not born out of unbelief, but out of faith. He wrestles with God because he believes God is there. He argues with heaven because he trusts heaven hears. To cry out in confusion is not to walk away, but to cling to the only one who can make sense of it all. This is where the beauty of Job's story begins to unfold. In his brokenness, Job shows us that faith is not about having all the answers, but about holding on to God when nothing makes sense. His ashes become holy ground. because there he discovers that God's presence is not absent in pain, but closer than ever. The cry of Job is the cry of humanity, and through his tears we are invited into the mystery of faith. He does not give us solutions. He gives us permission to weep, to question, to feel the weight of suffering, and still to whisper, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust him." Job's story is not just a tale of loss. It is the sacred testimony that even in the darkest night, the voice of faith can still rise. Number 2. The mystery of suffering and the limits of human wisdom. As Job sits in his pain, his friends arrive. At first they sit with him in silence, gesture of compassion. But soon, words begin to spill out, and with them, a dangerous theology. They insist that Job must have sinned, that his suffering is punishment, that life works on a simple equation. Good things happen to the righteous, bad things happen to the wicked. It sounds neat, but it is a lie wrapped in shallow comfort. Their reasoning is the reasoning of human wisdom. We long for answers that fit into boxes, explanations that make suffering predictable. If suffering can be explained, we think we can control it. If pain always matches guilt, then the world feels manageable. But the book of Job shatters that illusion. It tells us plainly, life is not that simple, and God's ways are not confined to our formulas. The friends of Job speak many words, but their words wound. They add shame to Job's sorrow, and condemnation to his grief. They embody what happens when human pride tries to interpret divine mysteries. In their certainty, they misrepresent God. In their attempts to defend him, they distort his justice. And the tragedy is that they speak with confidence but without wisdom. Here lies one of the greatest lessons of the book. Suffering cannot always be explained, and attempting to do so can cause greater harm. Job's friends remind us of the danger of careless words, of trying to be God's spokesperson without understanding his heart. True comfort is not found in answers, but in presence. Sometimes the most spiritual act is not to explain, but to weep with those who weep. Through this, we see the limits of human wisdom. Our understanding is fragile, partial, like a shadow compared to the brilliance of God's light. To insist we know how God runs the world is arrogance. To acknowledge that his wisdom surpasses ours is humility. And humility is the beginning of wisdom. Job's friends wanted to defend God by blaming Job. But God does not need defenders who twist his character. What he desires are hearts that trust, even when they cannot trace his hand. The mystery of suffering remains, but within it the invitation is clear: to let go of shallow explanations and fall into the arms of a God whose wisdom is higher than the heavens. This is the wisdom the world resists, because it demands surrender. It asks us to trust when we cannot see, to believe when we cannot understand, to worship when our hearts are breaking. Yet this is the very wisdom that sets us free, free from the illusion of control, free from the weight of false guilt, free to rest in the one who knows the end from the beginning. Number 3. Job's honest struggle with God. The heart of the book of Job beats with raw, unfiltered honesty. Job does not sit quietly while his world falls apart. He does not mask his pain in polite words or hide his confusion behind empty rituals. Instead, he lifts his voice to heaven and pours out his anguish before the very God he cannot understand. His laments echo through the pages like thunder rolling across a dark sky. I cry out to you, O God, but you do not answer. This is not rebellion. This is faith in its most desperate form. Job speaks to God because he believes God is listening. He dares to wrestle with the Almighty because he believes there is a relationship to wrestle for. In his cries, he reveals that true faith is not silence, but bringing our deepest wounds into the presence of the one who can heal them. We often think faith means suppressing doubt, pretending we are strong, or offering God only our best words. But Job shows us another way. Faith can sound like weeping. Faith can sound like frustration. Faith can sound like questions that have no easy answers. To bring our pain into prayer is to refuse to let suffering sever our connection with God. It is to cling, even when every reason to let go surrounds us. Job's struggle teaches us something vital. God is not offended by our honesty. He does not recoil from our tears or turn away from our questions. He welcomes the heart that pours itself out before him. The psalmists understood this, crying out in their anguish. And Jesus himself echoed Job's lament when he hung on the cross and cried, my God, why have you forsaken me?" To struggle with God is not weakness. It is intimacy. Job reminds us that prayer is not about polished words, but about real presence. God desires truth in the innermost being, and Job gives him exactly that. He does not walk away. He does not curse God. He clings, even through complaint, even through confusion, because somewhere in his heart Job knows God is still there. In this, Job gives us permission to bring our full selves to God. The joy, the pain, the anger, the confusion. He teaches us that faith does not mean avoiding hard questions, but entrusting them to the only one who holds the answers. Job's struggle is our invitation to lay our burdens bare before the Lord, knowing that in his presence even the darkest cries are heard and held. Number 4. God's response from the whirlwind. At the peak of Job's cries, when human explanations have failed and silence has stretched long, God finally speaks. But his answer is not what Job or we might expect. He does not provide a list of reasons for Job's suffering. He does not explain the hidden workings of heaven. Instead, out of a whirlwind, God reveals himself. The voice of the Almighty shakes the air, asking Job questions that stretch across creation. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Who shut in the sea with doors? Have you commanded the morning since your days began? It is not cruelty. It is majesty. God pulls back the veil to show Job a vision of the cosmos, the vastness of the universe, the intricacy of the creatures, the mysteries of the deep. At first it may seem as though God avoids Job's question, but the deeper wisdom is this. Job did not need an explanation. He needed revelation. He needed to see that the God who governs the stars also governs his pain. He needed to remember that the one who cares for the wild beasts, the storms, and the oceans also holds the details of his broken life in his hand. God's response is not a theology lesson. It is an encounter. In the whirlwind, Job is brought face to face with the sheer greatness of God. And that vision changes everything. When Job finally speaks again, his words are no longer filled with demands but with awe. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you. This moment is the turning point of the book. Job does not receive answers to his questions, but he receives something greater. He meets the God who is beyond the questions, and in that encounter his heart finds rest. For us, this is a profound lesson. When life shatters and prayers seem unanswered, what we need most is not explanations, but the presence of God. We need to be reminded that the world is not out of control, but held together by a wisdom greater than ours. We need to be reminded that the storms we fear are still subject to the voice of the Creator. God's response to Job is the same invitation he extends to us. To lift our eyes from our pain and behold his majesty, to see that our lives are part of something vast and beautiful, orchestrated by hands far wiser than our own. And when we see him, truly see him, our hearts, like Job's, can finally rest in awe and trust. Number 5, the wisdom of trust, learning our place in God's world. When Job finally encounters the voice of God, his perspective shifts. He does not suddenly understand all the reasons behind his suffering, but he understands something greater. He knows his place in the grand design of creation. He sees the vastness of God's wisdom and the smallness of his own. And with that vision, Job's heart moves from demanding answers to resting in trust. Trust is not easy when the world feels unfair. Our minds crave explanations. Our hearts long for justice we can see. And our souls ache for the assurance that suffering has meaning. Yet the book of Job shows us that wisdom does not come from having every answer, but from surrendering to the one who does. The wisdom of trust begins when we admit that we are not God, and we never were meant to be. This kind of trust is not blind. It is not pretending that pain is easy, or that tragedy is light. It is a deep, courageous faith that looks at the mystery of life and says, I cannot understand, but I will trust the God who does. Job models this when he finally bows before the greatness of God and declares, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. We live in a culture that prizes control. We want to chart every course, predict every outcome, and guard ourselves against the unknown. But the wisdom of Job pulls us into a different reality. The humility of knowing that God governs the world in ways far beyond our grasp. This is not meant to crush us, but to free us. Because if the world depended on our wisdom, it would collapse. But it rests in God's hands, and He is faithful. In practical terms, this wisdom of trust changes everything. It means we can face suffering without losing hope. It means we can carry unanswered questions without being destroyed by them. It means we can worship not because we understand, but because we know the one who does. Trust turns despair into surrender, and surrender into peace. Job's story reminds us that God does not ask us to run the universe. That is His job. What He asks is that we lean on Him, that we rest in His sovereignty, that we walk humbly with Him even through the shadow. The wisdom of trust is not about knowing everything, but about knowing Him and finding in Him a peace that passes all understanding. Number 6. Restoration and redemption. God's surprising ending. After the whirlwind, after the surrender, after Job bows in awe, something unexpected happens. God restores Job. His health returns, his wealth is multiplied, his family grows again, and the years of his life are blessed with abundance. It feels like a conclusion, but it is far more than a happy ending. It is a revelation of redemption. The restoration of Job's fortunes is not a promise that every earthly story will end with wealth, health, and joy returned. Instead, it is a glimpse of God's greater purpose, that suffering is never the final word. Loss is not the end of the story. With God, there is always more beyond the ashes. Job's greatest restoration was not in possessions, but in his relationship with God. Before his trials, Job had known about God. After his trials, Job had encountered Him. He declares, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. That vision, that intimacy, was the true treasure Job gained from his suffering. Still, the return of blessing carries a message of hope for us today. It tells us that God is not indifferent to our pain. He is not content to leave us in despair. In His time and His way, He brings redemption. Sometimes it happens in this life, sometimes it waits for eternity. But the character of God assures us that brokenness will not last forever. For every believer, Job's ending points to the greater restoration found in Christ. Just as Job's losses were reversed, so too in Jesus our greatest losses will be redeemed. Death will give way to life. Tears will be wiped away. Mourning will turn to joy. Job's story whispers the truth that will one day shout across eternity. Our Redeemer lives, and in Him all things will be made new. The restoration also speaks to God's justice. Job's friends, who had misread in God, are corrected, and Job becomes the one who prays for them. Even here we see redemption, not just for Job, but for those who wronged him. God's mercy extends beyond the one who suffered to those who failed Him, revealing that His redemption is wide enough to cover all. In the ashes, Job found God. In the whirlwind, Job found trust. And in the restoration, Job discovered that God's goodness is greater than suffering, and his redemption deeper than despair. For us, this truth shines like light breaking through the storm. No matter how dark the night, in God's hands the dawn will come. Number 7. The cross in Job. How Christ fulfills the cry of Job. All throughout Job's story, a deeper shadow stretches across the pages. It is the image of the innocent sufferer, the one who endures pain, not because of sin, but despite his righteousness. Job's cries echo across centuries until they find their ultimate fulfillment in Christ, the one who bore the weight of the world's suffering on the cross. Job asked questions that seemed unanswered. He cried, "Why was I born to see misery? And where is God in my pain?" Centuries later, Jesus, the perfect Son of God, would step into human flesh and give voice to that same lament. My God, why have you forsaken me?" In that moment, Christ became the true and final Job, the righteous sufferer who entrusted himself fully into the Father's hands. The book of Job shows us the limits of human understanding, but the cross shows us the fullness of God's love. At Calvary, God did not give us an explanation for suffering. He gave us himself. He entered into our pain, carried our sin, and conquered death so that we could have life. Where Job saw only glimpses of God's majesty, the cross reveals his heart, a love so deep that he chose to suffer with us and for us. Through Christ, the cry of Job is answered, not with words, but with redemption. The cross declares that suffering is not meaningless. It is the place where God brings forth salvation. The resurrection proclaims that suffering does not have the final word. Life and victory do. Jesus fulfills Job's longing not by removing pain from the world, but by transforming it into the very path of glory. When we stand at the foot of the cross, we see that the God who governs the stars is also the God who wore a crown of thorns. The one who set boundaries for the seas also let nails pierce his hands. The creator of all became the redeemer of all. Job's story points us here, to the place where every unanswered question finds its rest, not in explanation but in the presence of Christ crucified and risen. This is the wisdom of God, that through suffering, he brings salvation, that through death, he brings life, and that through the cross, he fulfills the ancient cry of every broken heart. In Jesus, Job's story becomes our hope, and our hope becomes unshakable. Conclusion: trusting the God who runs the world. As we close the story of Job, we are left with more than a tale of one man's suffering and restoration. We are left with a vision of God's wisdom, a wisdom that far surpasses human understanding. We see a God who is not bound by our formulas, who cannot be reduced to our explanations, but who governs the world with power, justice, and love. Job reminds us that suffering is part of the mystery of life, but it is not the end of the story. He teaches us that we are free to cry out, free to question, free to wrestle with God, and that in doing so, we draw nearer to him, not further away. In the whirlwind, God does not explain, but he reveals himself. And in that revelation, Job finds what he was truly searching for, not reasons but relationship. This is where the wisdom of Job meets the wisdom of the cross. In both, we see that God's ways are higher than ours, his plans deeper than we can fathom, and his love more powerful than the darkest night. We are not called to understand everything. We are called to trust the one who understands all. So, when the storms rage and the questions remain, remember Job. Remember his ashes, his cries, his honesty, and his faith. Remember that even in his darkest hour, God was there, listening. And remember that through Christ, we have an even greater assurance that God is not only with us but within us, carrying us through every trial, redeeming every sorrow, and promising a day when all things will be made new. The wisdom of Job is not that life will be easy, but that God will be faithful. It is not that suffering will vanish today, but that one day it will be swallowed up in victory. Until then, we walk in trust. We worship in faith. We cling to the cross. And like Job, we declare, I know that my Redeemer lives and that in the end he will stand upon the earth. That is the hope that sustains us. That is the truth that anchors us. And that is the wisdom that shows us how God runs the world. Not with randomness, not with cruelty, but with a love that reaches beyond time, beyond pain and into eternity.